Nobody warned Zariah Monroe that the worst betrayal of her life would arrive beneath glowing lanterns and wedding music. Watching the man she loved for 5 years marry her cousin, while Seoul's most dangerous mafia boss stood in the shadows, remembering the favor she once gave him and the debt he had been waiting 4 years to repay. If you want to see how far revenge, power, and unexpected love can take a woman who is always too strong for weak men, stay until the end. And drop a like and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The traditional Korean garden outside Seoul looked like something stolen from a dream. Lotus ponds reflecting gold light, paper lanterns swaying in the cold evening breeze, jazz floating softly between ancient pine trees. Guests smiled, toasted champagne, and whispered behind elegant masks of politeness, while photographers moved through the crowd capturing moments designed to look spontaneous. Zariah Monroe sat in the fifth row wearing a deep wine-red dress that felt more like armor than fabric. Her hands rested carefully in her lap, fingers interlaced to keep them still, because if she let them move, she would start shaking, and she refused to give anyone in this garden the satisfaction of seeing her break. The bride was her cousin. The groom was the man Zariah had spent 5 years loving, supporting, and rebuilding every time his ambition collapsed underneath the weight of his own mediocrity. Adrian Cole stood at the altar in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of the rent Zariah used to cover for him, back when they were struggling together in a cramped studio apartment near Hongdae. His hair was perfectly styled now. His smile was confident. He looked like a man who had finally become the person he always believed he deserved to be. And beside him, glowing in white silk like victory personified, stood Vanessa Monroe, Zariah's cousin, the woman who had spent their entire childhood taking things that didn't belong to her and smiling while she did it. The officiant spoke in Korean and English, his voice warm and practiced, talking about love and commitment and the joining of two souls. Zariah heard the words, but they sounded distant, like they were being spoken underwater. Her throat felt tight. Her chest ached. She kept her expression blank because years of surviving in corporate boardrooms had taught her how to hide everything that mattered. When Adrian and Vanessa kissed, the garden erupted in applause. Zariah clapped too. Her hands made the correct sounds. Her face maintained the correct expression, and inside her chest, something quietly shattered. The reception unfolded exactly the way expensive weddings always did. String lights glowing above white-draped tables, servers moving smoothly through the crowd with trays of champagne and delicate appetizers, laughter rising and falling like music. Zariah found a seat near the back, away from the main tables where family sat, and tried to calculate how long she needed to stay before leaving without causing a scene. Vanessa found her anyway. She appears beside Zariah's table wearing her wedding dress and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, holding a champagne flute like a prop. She leaned down, close enough that her perfume, something expensive and floral, filled the space between them. "I'm so glad you came," Vanessa said sweetly, her voice pitched just low enough that nobody nearby could hear. "I wasn't sure you would." Zariah looked up at her cousin and kept her voice calm. "Why wouldn't I?" Vanessa's smile widened, "Because you always did have trouble letting go of things that were never really yours." The words landed like a blade between ribs. Precise, intentional, designed to hurt. Zariah took a slow breath and forced herself to keep looking at Vanessa without flinching. "Congratulations on your marriage." "Thank you." Vanessa tilted her head slightly, studying Zariah the way someone might study an insect trapped beneath glass. "You know what the funny thing is? I didn't even have to try very hard. Adrian practically fell into my arms the moment he realized what I could offer him." "And what was that?" "A future without you." Vanessa's voice dropped even lower, almost intimate now, like she was sharing a secret between friends. "He told me once that being with you made him feel small, like he was always failing some test he didn't know he was taking." Zariah's hands tightened around the stem of her untouched champagne glass. She wanted to throw it. She wanted to scream. She wanted to stand up and walk out of this garden and never look back. Instead, she stayed perfectly still. "You were always too much, Zariah," Vanessa continued, her tone almost pitying now. "Too smart, too independent, too everything. Men don't want that. They want someone who makes them feel powerful, not someone who reminds them of everything they're not. Zariah met her cousin's eyes and spoke quietly. Is that what you tell yourself? Vanessa straightened, her smile flickering for just a moment before returning full force. I don't need to tell myself anything. I'm the one wearing the ring. She turned and walked away, her white dress trailing behind her like a victory flag, leaving Zariah sitting alone at a table full of empty chairs while the reception continued around her like nothing had happened. Zariah stood eventually, her legs unsteady beneath her, and moved away from the tables toward the edge of the garden where the lotus pond reflected lantern light across dark water. She needed air. She needed space. She needed to be anywhere that wasn't here. That's when she saw him. He was standing near the koi pond, partially hidden beneath the shadow of an ancient pine tree, watching the reception with the detached interest of someone who didn't belong to the celebration but had been invited anyway. He wore a black tailored suit that fit him like it had been built specifically for his frame, and his hair, stark white despite the fact that he couldn't have been older than 35, caught the light in a way that made him impossible to ignore. Zariah recognized him immediately, not because they had ever spoken, but because 4 years ago she had saved his empire from collapse without ever knowing his name. Kang Taemin, the most feared mafia boss in Seoul. A ghost whispered about in luxury hotels, political circles, and underground clubs where powerful men lowered their voices whenever his name entered the room. He controlled entire criminal networks beneath the polished surface of South Korea's elite economy. Money laundering, information brokerage, political leverage, territorial enforcement. The kind of man who could destroy lives with a single phone call and never leave a fingerprint. And 4 years ago, he watched Zariah walk into a boardroom and challenge a room full of powerful men without fear. He never forgot her. Zariah froze beside the lotus pond, her pulse suddenly loud in her ears, because Kang Taemin was looking directly at her now, and there was recognition in his expression, the kind of recognition that suggested he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. He moved toward her with the controlled stillness of a predator who never needed to announce danger. His footsteps barely made a sound against the garden path. When he stopped a few feet away from her, close enough to speak without being overheard, Zariah noticed the tattoos that covered his hands, intricate patterns that disappeared beneath the cuffs of his suit jacket and probably continued up his arms beneath the expensive fabric. Zariah Monroe, he said quietly, his voice low and precise, carrying the faint trace of a Seoul accent underneath flawless English. I have been looking for you for 4 years. Zariah's throat went dry. I don't think we've ever met. No, Taemin agreed. But I remember you. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. 4 years ago, Zariah had worked as a financial consultant for a mid-tier subcontracting firm connected to one of Taemin's corporate front companies. During a high-level financial review, the kind of meeting where junior consultants were expected to sit quietly and take notes, she discovered a catastrophic error hidden inside a revenue projection that would have cost billions and triggered international investigations. Nobody else caught it, but Zariah did, and she corrected it publicly, standing in front of a room full of senior executives who looked at her like she had just committed career suicide, and explained exactly why the numbers didn't work and what needed to change. The room had gone silent. Then the company's CFO, a man Zariah later learned reported directly to Kang Taemin, thanked her coldly and dismissed the meeting. Zariah thought she was going to be fired. Instead, 2 weeks later, she received a plain black business card in the mail with no name, no title, just a phone number printed in silver ink and a handwritten note on the back. One favor. Any request. Any time. She kept the card in her wallet for months, unsure what to do with it, until Adrian's desperation became unbearable and she finally made the call. Standing in the wedding garden now, watching Kang Taemin look at her with the dangerous calm of a man who survived violence his entire life, Zariah suddenly understood the weight of what she had done. You used the favor, Taemin said softly, but not for yourself. Zariah swallowed hard. No, you used it for him. Taemin's gaze shifted briefly toward the reception tables where Adrian stood laughing with a group of guests, his arm around Vanessa's waist. The man who just married your cousin. I didn't know he was going to... Zariah stopped herself, her voice catching. She didn't owe this man an explanation. She didn't owe anyone an explanation. But Taemin was still watching her, and there was something in his expression that looked almost like disappointment. "You gave away the most valuable thing you had," he said quietly, "to someone who didn't deserve it." Zariah's hands curled into fists at her sides. "It doesn't matter now." "Doesn't it?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unignorable. Taemin reached into his jacket and pulled out another black business card, identical to the first one, except this time there was no handwritten note. He held it out toward her. "The favor still stands," he said, "but this time use it for yourself." Zariah stared at the card without taking it. "Why?" "Because I value intelligence more than loyalty," Taemin replied. "And you showed me both 4 years ago when you had no reason to do either." He placed the card on the stone ledge beside the lotus pond when Zariah didn't move to take it, and then he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the shadows beneath the pine trees like he had never been there at all. Zariah stood alone beside the water, staring at the black card while the wedding reception continued behind her and the cold Seoul night pressed against her skin. She picked up the card. This time, she was going to use it. 3 days later, Zariah stood outside a sleek glass building in Gangnam that looked like every other corporate headquarters in Seoul's financial district. Marble floors, minimalist design, security guards in dark suits stationed near the entrance. The kind of place where billion-dollar deals happen behind closed doors, and nobody asked too many questions about where the money came from. She walked through the lobby holding the black business card like a passport, and the moment the receptionist saw it, her expression changed from polite indifference to immediate attention. 15th floor, the woman said quietly, gesturing toward a private elevator that required a key card to access. Zariah stepped inside and watched the numbers climb while her heart hammered against her ribs. The elevator opened directly into a penthouse office that overlooked the entire city. Floor-to-ceiling windows framing Seoul's skyline like a living photograph. Expensive furniture arranged with the kind of precision that suggested someone powerful cared deeply about control. Kang Taemin stood near the windows with his back to her, his white hair catching the afternoon light. He was wearing another perfectly tailored suit, this one charcoal gray, and when he turned to face her, his expression was unreadable. "You came," he said simply. "You said the favor still stands." Zariah's voice sounded steadier than she felt. "I want to use it." Taemin moved toward his desk, a massive black surface that looked more like a piece of modern art than furniture, and gestured for her to sit in one of the chairs across from him. Zariah sat carefully, keeping her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap. "What do you want?" Taemin asked, settling into his own chair with the casual authority of someone who owned everything in the room, including the conversation. Zariah took a breath. "A job?" Taemin's eyebrows lifted slightly. "A job?" "Yes." "You could ask for anything," he said slowly. "Money, protection, revenge, and you're asking for a job." "I don't want your money," Zariah replied. "I want to earn it." For a long moment, Taemin just looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. Then he leaned back in his chair and smiled. Not the polite smile men wore at business meetings, but something genuine and almost dangerous. "Tell me what happened," he said quietly. So Zariah did. She told him about Adrian, about 5 years of supporting a man who resented her for every success she earned and every failure he caused. About coming home to an empty apartment one day and finding nothing but a note saying he needed space. About the months of silence that followed until the wedding invitation arrived in the mail with Vanessa's name printed beside his. She told him about the garden, about Vanessa's whispered cruelty, about sitting in that chair surrounded by empty seats while the man she loved celebrated a future that didn't include her. And when she finished, Taemin was quiet for a long time. "You used the favor to help him," he said finally. "Didn't you?" Zariah nodded. "He was struggling, failing at everything. I thought if he just had one real opportunity, he would love you the way you deserved," Taemin finished softly. Zariah looked down at her hands. "Yes. And instead, he used that opportunity to leave you." "Yes." Taemin stood and walked back toward the windows, his hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the city like he was calculating something complicated. "The position I gave him," he said without turning around, was inside one of my legitimate business operations. Corporate finance, clean money. He reports to a division head who reports to me. Zariah's stomach tightened. I didn't know. I know you didn't. Taemin's voice was calm, almost gentle. You asked for help. I provided it. What he did with that help was his choice, not yours. He turned back to face her, his expression serious now. If I give you a job, he said carefully, it won't be charity, it won't be pity, and it won't be because I feel sorry for you. Do you understand? Yes. I will expect you to work harder than anyone else in this building. I will expect results. And I will not tolerate weakness. Zariah met his eyes. I've never asked for anything less. Taemin studied her for another long moment, and then he nodded once. You start Monday, he said. Financial strategy, corporate operations, legitimate businesses only. I keep that world separate from the other one. What's my title? Senior Strategic Consultant, Taemin replied. For now. What you become after that depends entirely on what you're capable of. Zariah stood, her legs unsteady, but her voice firm. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Taemin said quietly. You haven't seen what this world costs. But Zariah had already paid more than most people ever would, and she wasn't afraid of the price anymore. The first 2 weeks inside Kang Taemin's empire taught Zariah more about power than 5 years in corporate consulting ever had. The office operated like a machine, efficient, ruthless, and completely intolerant of failure. Taemin's people moved through the building like soldiers executing orders, their loyalty absolute and their discretion unquestionable. Nobody asked questions they didn't need answered. Nobody spoke about the other side of the business, the criminal networks that funded everything underneath the polished corporate surface. And nobody underestimated Zariah twice. Her first assignment was restructuring a failing logistics operation that had been hemorrhaging money for 6 months. The division head, a man in his 50s who looked at Zariah like she was a secretary who wandered into the wrong meeting, dismissed her analysis within the first 10 minutes. We've already tried cost reduction, he said impatiently. It doesn't work. Zariah looked at him calmly. You tried cutting operational expenses. I'm recommending you cut the entire executive management structure and rebuild from the ground up. The room went silent. That's insane, the division head said flatly. That's accurate, Zariah corrected. Your senior managers are incompetent, overpaid, and actively sabotaging efficiency to protect their own positions. Fire all of them. Promote the 3 junior analysts who actually understand the supply chain. You'll save $8 million a month and double productivity within a quarter. The division head stared at her like she had just suggested burning the building down. Then Kang Taemin's voice came through the conference call speaker, quiet and absolute. Do it. 2 weeks later, the logistics operation was profitable again. And Zariah's reputation inside the organization shifted from Taemin's new consultant to the woman who cleaned house and made it look easy. She worked 16-hour days, she lived inside spreadsheets and financial models and operational audits. She exposed corruption, restructured teams, fired executives who thought their positions were untouchable, and earned the terrified respect of people who had spent years surviving inside Taemin's empire by never making waves. And slowly, carefully, Kang Taemin started paying attention to her in a way that had nothing to do with business. It started with small things. Late-night emails asking for her opinion on decisions that had nothing to do with her current projects. Invitations to private strategy meetings where she was the only consultant in a room full of syndicate leadership. A standing order that any report she submitted went directly to his desk before anyone else saw it. Then one Friday evening, 3 months after she started, Taemin appeared in her office doorway just as she was packing up to leave. Dinner, he said simply. Zariah looked up from her laptop, surprised. Excuse me? You've been working for 12 weeks without a single day off, Taemin continued, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. I'm ordering you to take a break. I'm fine. You're exhausted, he corrected, and you're going to burn out if you keep pushing yourself like this. Zariah closed her laptop slowly. Is that your professional opinion? It's an observation, Taemin replied. Dinner, 1 hour, no work discussion. And if I say no, Taemin smiled slightly, then I'll fire you for insubordination. He was joking, probably. Zariah grabbed her jacket. They went to a small Korean barbecue restaurant tucked into a side street near Itaewon, the kind of place that didn't take reservations and smelled like charcoal smoke and sesame oil. Taemin ordered for both of them in rapid Korean, and when the food arrived, he cooked the meat himself, his tattooed hands moving with the same precision he brought to everything else. "You don't have to do this," Zariah said quietly, watching him turn the beef over the grill. "Do what?" "Pretend to care." Taemin looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Who says I'm pretending?" Zariah didn't have an answer for that. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the restaurant loud and warm around them, and then Taemin asked the question Zariah had been avoiding since the day she walked into his office. "Why did you really come to me?" Zariah set down her chopsticks. "I told you I needed a job." "You could have found a job anywhere," Taemin replied. "You didn't need me for that. Maybe I wanted to prove something." "To who?" Zariah looked at him across the table, this dangerous man who controlled Seoul's underworld and somehow found time to take her to dinner in a restaurant that probably cost less than the suit he was wearing. "To myself," she admitted quietly. Taemin nodded slowly, like that answer made more sense than anything else she could have said. "You know what I remember most about that boardroom meeting 4 years ago?" he asked. "What?" "Everyone in that room was afraid," Taemin said. "Afraid of being wrong. Afraid of looking stupid. Afraid of consequences. But you stood up anyway and told the truth, even though you knew it would cost you." "It almost did," Zariah replied. "I thought I was going to lose my job." "You would have," Taemin agreed, "if I hadn't stopped it." Zariah blinked. "What?" "The CFO wanted you fired immediately," Taemin continued. "He said you embarrassed the company, made the executives look incompetent. I told him if he touched you, I'd remove him instead." "Why?" Taemin leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes steady on hers. "Because people who tell the truth are rare. And people who tell the truth when it's dangerous are even rarer. I don't waste resources like that." Zariah's throat felt tight. "So you've been watching me?" "Yes." "For 4 years?" "Yes." "That's—" Zariah stopped, unsure what word fit. "Creepy. Flattering. Terrifying." "Strategic," Taemin finished calmly. "I watch everyone worth watching. You just happen to be worth watching longer than most." He poured more soju into her glass and then his own, and they sat there in the warm restaurant while Seoul's Friday night unfolded around them, and Zariah tried to figure out what it meant that the most dangerous man in the city looked at her like she was the only person in the room. Later, standing outside the restaurant while the cold November air pressed against their skin and taxis rushed past on the street, Taemin turned to her and asked one more question. "Do you regret it?" "Regret what?" "Using the favor for him instead of yourself." Zariah thought about Adrian, about Vanessa, about 5 years of making herself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. "No," she said finally, "because it brought me here." Taemin looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and then he nodded once. "Good," he said quietly. And for the first time in months, Zariah felt like maybe she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The confrontation happened on a cold Saturday afternoon in December, inside a designer department store in Gangnam. Zariah was shopping for professional clothes, the kind of tailored pieces that sent the right message in boardrooms full of men who judged women by their appearance before listening to a single word they said. She was examining a charcoal blazer when she heard the voice she had been avoiding for months. "Well, well, look who finally learned how to dress like an adult." Zariah turned slowly. Vanessa stood a few feet away wearing a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than Zariah's monthly rent, her wedding ring catching the store's overhead lights like a deliberate announcement. She looked polished, confident, and exactly like someone who had never been told no in her entire life. "Vanessa," Zariah said evenly. "I heard you were working now," Vanessa continued, moving closer with the predatory grace of someone who enjoyed watching other people squirm. "Something corporate? How cute." "How's married life?" Zariah asked, keeping her voice neutral. Vanessa's smile widened. "Perfect. Adrian's doing so well. We just moved into a new apartment in Cheongdam-dong. You should see it. Floor-to-ceiling windows, rooftop terrace, the works. I'm happy for you. Are you? Vanessa tilted her head slightly, studying Zariah the way she always had, like she was searching for weakness. Because you look exactly the same as you did at the wedding, still alone, still pretending you don't care. Zariah took a slow breath and forced herself to stay calm. I'm fine, Vanessa. Fine, Vanessa repeated, laughing softly. That's exactly the problem with you, Zariah. You're always fine, always handling things, always so strong and independent. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. But here's the thing. Nobody wants a woman who's that strong. Men want someone they can protect, someone who needs them. And you? She shook her head slowly. You don't need anyone. That's why you'll always be alone. The words should have hurt. 6 months ago, they would have destroyed her. But standing in that expensive department store wearing clothes she bought with money, she earned herself. Working for a man who valued her intelligence instead of fearing it, Zariah felt something shift inside her chest. She looked at her cousin, this woman who had spent their entire lives taking things that didn't belong to her, and smiled. You're right, Zariah said quietly. I don't need anyone. I rebuilt my life alone, and some things are stronger without help. Vanessa's smile faltered. Enjoy your apartment, Zariah continued, her voice steady and calm. I hope it's everything you deserve. She turned and walked away, leaving Vanessa standing alone in the middle of the store, and for the first time in her life, Zariah didn't look back. But Adrian was waiting near the exit. He looked different than he had at the wedding, older somehow, the confidence slightly forced now, like he was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit anymore. When he saw Zariah approaching, his expression shifted into something complicated and painful. Zariah, he said quietly, can we talk? Every instinct told her to walk past him, but something made her stop. What do you want, Adrian? He glanced around the store, suddenly uncomfortable, and then gestured toward a quieter corner near the escalators. Zariah followed reluctantly, her arms crossed, her expression guarded. I know you probably hate me, Adrian began. I don't hate you, Zariah said flatly. I don't feel anything about you at all. The words landed harder than any insult could have. Adrian flinched. I deserve that. Yes, you do. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture achingly familiar, and Zariah hated that some part of her still remembered what it felt like to care about him. I need you to understand something, Adrian said quietly. What happened between us? You left, Zariah interrupted. You disappeared for 6 months and then married my cousin. There's nothing complicated about that. It wasn't about you, Adrian continued desperately. It was about me, about how you made me feel. And how did I make you feel? Adrian looked at her, his expression raw and honest in a way she hadn't seen from him in years. Small, he admitted, like I was always failing some test I didn't know I was taking. You were so smart, so capable, so... He stopped, searching for the word. So much. And I couldn't keep up. Zariah stared at him, her chest tight, because this was the truth she had always suspected but never wanted to confirm. She had loved him, and he had resented her for it. So you found someone who made you feel bigger? She said quietly. Vanessa doesn't challenge me, Adrian replied. She makes things easy. And I made things hard. Yes. The admission hung between them like something broken that couldn't be fixed. Zariah took a slow breath and looked at the man she had spent 5 years trying to save from himself, and suddenly she saw him clearly for the first time, not as someone she loved, but as someone too weak to handle being loved by someone stronger than him. I hope she makes you happy, Adrian, Zariah said finally. I really do. She turned and walked out of the store into the cold December afternoon, and this time she didn't stop. That night, Zariah stood in Kang Taemin's penthouse overlooking Seoul's glowing skyline. He had called her an hour after the department store encounter, his voice calm and professional, asking if she was free for a strategy session about an upcoming corporate acquisition. Zariah said yes because she needed the distraction and because some part of her was starting to crave the weight of his attention in a way that felt dangerous and inevitable. Now she stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows while Taemin poured expensive whiskey into 2 glasses and the city burned bright beneath them like a promise. You're quiet tonight, Taemin observed, handing her a glass. Long day, Zariah replied. Tell me. So she did. She told him about Vanessa, about the department store, about Adrian's confession that she had been too much, and that's why he left. And when she finished, Taemin was silent for a long time, standing beside her near the windows with his whiskey untouched and his white hair catching the reflected city lights. Do you believe him? He asked finally. About what? That you were too much. Zariah looked down at her glass. I don't know. Maybe I was. Or maybe, Taemin said quietly, he was just too weak. Zariah glanced at him, surprised by the anger she heard beneath his calm tone. Men like that, Taemin continued, his voice low and controlled, spend their entire lives blaming strong women for their own failures. They want someone they can control, someone who makes them feel powerful without requiring them to actually be powerful. He turned to face her fully now. You terrified him because you didn't need him, and that made him realize he had nothing to offer you except weakness disguised as love. Zariah's throat felt tight. You don't know him. I know men like him, Taemin replied. I've destroyed dozens of them. They're all the same, insecure, resentful, and too cowardly to admit that the problem was never you. He moved closer, and Zariah could smell his cologne now. Something expensive and subtle that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. You want to know what I see when I look at you? Taemin asked softly. Zariah's pulse quickened. What? Someone who walked into a room full of powerful men 4 years ago and told them the truth, even though it could have destroyed her career. Someone who gave away the most valuable thing she had to help a man who didn't deserve it. Someone who survived betrayal and came out stronger instead of broken. He paused. That's not too much, Zariah. That's everything. The words settled into her chest like something she had been waiting her whole life to hear. I don't know how to be loved without becoming smaller first, Zariah whispered, the confession escaping before she could stop it. Taemin looked at her with the dangerous calm of a man who had survived violence his entire life and learned that the only thing worth protecting was the truth. Then we learn another way, he said quietly. And standing in that penthouse high above Seoul, while the city glowed beneath them like fire, Zariah felt something shift inside her chest, not breaking, but opening. Maybe she didn't need to be smaller. Maybe she just needed someone strong enough to stand beside her without fear. Taemin reached out slowly and took the whiskey glass from her hand, setting it aside, and then he did something that surprised her more than anything else he could have done. He stepped back, giving her space, giving her choice. I'm not him, Taemin said softly, and I will never ask you to be less than what you are. Zariah looked at him, this dangerous man who controlled Seoul's underworld and somehow understood her better than anyone ever had. What happens now? She asked. Taemin smiled slightly, something genuine and almost vulnerable flickering across his expression. That, he said quietly, is entirely up to you. Zariah didn't sleep that night. She lay in her small apartment staring at the ceiling while Seoul's neon glow filtered through her curtains, and Taemin's words replayed in her mind like a song she couldn't stop hearing. I will never ask you to be less than what you are. The sentence felt dangerous. It felt like a promise nobody had ever been strong enough to keep before. She got up at 5 a.m, showered in water so hot it turned her skin pink, and dressed in the charcoal blazer she'd bought at the department store before Vanessa had tried to poison the entire afternoon. By 6:30, she was sitting in an empty coffee shop near Gangnam Station, drinking an Americano that tasted like burnt hope and watching early commuters flood the subway entrance across the street. Her phone buzzed. A text from Taemin. 3 words. Come see me. No explanation. No context. Just a command delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who knew she would obey. Zariah hated how right he was. She arrived at his building 20 minutes later and took the private elevator to the 15th floor. The doors opened directly into his penthouse office where morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows and made the entire city look clean and new and forgiving. Taemin stood near his desk wearing dark slacks and a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, exposing the intricate tattoos that covered his forearms. He looked like he'd been awake for hours. He looked like he never slept at all. You came quickly, he observed without turning around. You sounded like it was important. Everything's important, Taemin finally looked at her, his dark eyes steady and unreadable. But this is different. He gestured to a folder sitting on his desk, plain manila, unremarkable. The kind of thing that could contain anything from quarterly earnings reports to someone's entire life distilled into paper. Zariah moved closer, her pulse suddenly loud in her ears. "What is it?" "Open it." She did. Inside were financial records, employment contracts, performance reviews, and internal audit reports, all related to Adrian Cole and the division he'd been working in for the past year. Zariah skimmed the documents quickly, her consultant brain automatically cataloging the numbers, and what she saw made her stomach drop. Adrian's division was failing, not spectacularly, not obviously, but steadily, quietly, like a building with a cracked foundation that looked fine until someone actually checked the structural integrity. Missed targets, budget overruns, client complaints, operational inefficiencies that had been papered over with excuses and reassignments, and the kind of corporate sleight of hand that only worked until someone bothered to look closely. "How long has this been happening?" Zariah asked quietly. 6 months, Taemin replied. "Maybe longer. The division head has been covering for him." "Why?" "Because Adrian is married to someone with connections." Taemin's voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reading a weather report. "Your cousin's father owns a mid-sized import business, not significant on its own, but useful for certain logistical operations. The division head thought protecting Adrian was good politics." Zariah set the folder down carefully, her hands suddenly unsteady. "And you're showing me this because I'm ordering a full internal audit of that division," Taemin interrupted. "And I want you to lead it." The words landed like a fist to the chest. Zariah looked up at him sharply. "You can't be serious." "I'm always serious." "Taemin, I can't—" She stopped, trying to organize the chaos in her head into something coherent. "This is a conflict of interest. Adrian and I have history. Vanessa is my cousin. People will say—" "I don't care what people say," Taemin cut in, his voice hardening slightly. "I care about results. That division is hemorrhaging money and damaging the credibility of my entire corporate structure. I need someone I trust to clean it up." "Then send someone else." "There is no one else." Taemin moved around the desk and stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow and the absolute certainty in his expression. "You're the best analyst I have. You're ruthless when you need to be, and you don't let personal feelings compromise professional judgment." "You don't know that," Zariah said quietly. "Yes, I do." Taemin's voice softened slightly, but his eyes never left hers. 4 years ago, you corrected a catastrophic error in front of a room full of men who wanted you to fail. You didn't do it because it was easy. You did it because it was right. That's who you are." Zariah's throat felt tight. "What if I can't be objective?" "Then you tell me now, and I'll find someone else," Taemin replied. "But if you take this assignment, I expect you to do it the same way you do everything else. Completely and without mercy." She wanted to say no. Every rational part of her brain was screaming that this was a terrible idea, that auditing Adrian's division would look like revenge, that it would drag her back into a mess she'd spent months trying to escape. But another part of her, the part that had spent 5 years watching Adrian fail upward while she worked twice as hard for half the recognition, wanted to see exactly how deep his incompetence went. "When do I start?" she asked. Taemin smiled slightly. "Today." The audit took 3 weeks. Zariah assembled a small team of junior analysts who didn't ask questions and didn't care about office politics, and together they tore Adrian's division apart with the methodical precision of surgeons performing an autopsy. What they found was worse than the initial report suggested. Adrian hadn't just missed targets. He'd actively misrepresented performance data to his superiors, inflated projections to secure budget approvals, and reassigned blame for failures to subordinates who were too junior to defend themselves. He'd created a culture of fear and incompetence where people spent more time covering their tracks than actually doing their jobs. And the division head who'd been protecting him had been complicit in all of it. Zariah worked 16-hour days, lived on coffee and convenience store kimbap, and felt her anger harden into something cold and surgical. This wasn't about Adrian anymore. This was about an entire system that rewarded mediocrity as long as it came with the right connections. She submitted her preliminary findings to Taemin on a Friday afternoon. He read the report in silence while she sat across from his desk, trying not to let her exhaustion show. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "This is damning," he said quietly. "It's accurate." "I know." Taemin set the report aside and leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "How do you feel?" "About what?" "About destroying the man you spent 5 years loving." The question landed harder than Zariah expected. She took a slow breath and forced herself to meet Taemin's eyes. "I'm not destroying him. I'm documenting his failures. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes." Zariah's voice was steady now, certain. "He destroyed himself. I'm just making sure everyone sees it." Taemin nodded slowly, something that might have been approval flickering across his expression. "I'm scheduling a full review meeting next week. Executive leadership, division heads, the works. You'll present your findings directly." "Adrian will be there?" "Yes." Zariah's pulse quickened. "Good." "What?" The weekend before the review meeting, Vanessa called. Zariah almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out over common sense. "What do you want, Vanessa?" "We need to talk." Her cousin's voice sounded strained, the usual confidence cracking slightly around the edges. "Can you meet me?" "No?" "Zariah, please, I said no." Zariah kept her voice flat, emotionless. "If you have something to say it now." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then Vanessa spoke again, quieter this time. "I know about the audit." Zariah's stomach tightened. "How?" "Adrian told me. He's terrified, Zariah. He thinks you're trying to ruin him." "I'm doing my job." "Your job?" Vanessa's voice sharpened. "You're targeting him deliberately. Everyone knows it. You're using your position to settle a personal grudge." "Is that what Adrian told you?" "It's what anyone with eyes can see," Vanessa snapped. "You couldn't handle losing him, so now you're trying to destroy his career." Zariah laughed, a short, bitter sound that surprised her. "You really don't know him at all, do you?" "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means Adrian didn't lose his job because of me," Zariah replied coldly. "He's losing it because he's incompetent, because he lied about performance data and blamed other people for his failures, because he built an entire career on connections instead of capability. That's not true." "Read the audit report when it goes public next week," Zariah interrupted. "Then tell me I'm lying." She hung up before Vanessa could respond. Her hands were shaking. She stood in her apartment staring at her phone while her chest heaved and something that felt dangerously close to satisfaction burned in her stomach. Part of her felt guilty for the cruelty in her voice, but a larger part, the part that had spent years being made to feel too much, too smart, too everything, felt vindicated. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Taemin. "Dinner? My place. Me? Now." Zariah grabbed her jacket. Taemin's penthouse looked different at night. The city lights turned the floor-to-ceiling windows into something almost cinematic, Seoul glowing beneath them like a living organism, millions of people moving through their lives, completely unaware that 15 floors above them, a mafia boss and a financial analyst were sitting at a dining table eating japchae and trying to pretend the tension between them was purely professional. "Vanessa called you," Taemin said. It wasn't a question. Zariah looked up from her food, surprised. "How did you know?" "Because you look like you want to set something on fire." She almost smiled. "Is it that obvious?" "To me it is." Taemin poured more soju into her glass and then his own. "What did she say?" "That I'm targeting Adrian, that everyone knows it, that I'm using my position to settle a personal grudge." "Are you?" Zariah met his eyes across the table. "You already know the answer to that." "I want to hear you say it." "No," Zariah replied firmly. "I'm not targeting him. I'm doing exactly what you hired me to do, finding the truth and reporting it accurately. The fact that the truth happens to destroy Adrian's career is just a consequence, not a goal." Taemin studied her for a long moment, and then he nodded once. "Good," he said quietly, "because next week is going to be brutal." "I know. The division head will try to discredit you. Adrian will play the victim. People will question your motives. I can handle it. I know you can, Taemin replied, but I need you to understand something. He leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes locked on hers. Once you present those findings in front of executive leadership, there's no going back. Adrian will lose his position, probably his entire career, and everyone will know you were responsible. Good, Zariah said coldly. Taemin's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been concern flickering across his face. Are you sure you want this? Want what? Revenge. The word hung between them like something heavy and unavoidable. Zariah set down her chopsticks carefully. This isn't revenge. This is accountability. It can be both. Maybe. She looked at Taemin across the table. This dangerous man who controlled Seoul's underworld and somehow cared enough to ask if she was certain about destroying someone who destroyed her first. But I'm tired of being the one who's always supposed to be gracious. Who's supposed to forgive and move on and pretend everything's fine? Adrian used me for 5 years and then threw me away the moment he found someone easier. Vanessa spent our entire lives taking things that didn't belong to her, and everyone just expected me to smile and accept it. And now? Now they're going to see exactly what happens when you underestimate someone who's too much. Taemin smiled, not the polite smile he wore in business meetings, but something genuine and almost proud. Then let them watch, he said quietly. They finished dinner in comfortable silence, and afterward Taemin walked her to the elevator. But before the doors opened, he stopped and turned to face her, standing close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the faint stubble along his jaw. I need to tell you something, he said quietly. What? I'm in love with you. The confession landed like a grenade dropped into still water. Zariah froze, her pulse suddenly hammering against her ribs, her breath catching in her throat. Taemin, I know, he interrupted gently. I know the timing is terrible. I know you're not ready. I know we're in the middle of something complicated and brutal, and you have every reason not to trust men who claim to care about you. He paused, his eyes searching hers. But I need you to know that what I feel for you has nothing to do with business, nothing to do with gratitude or respect or professional admiration. I'm in love with you because you're the first person I've met in 20 years who isn't afraid of me. Zariah's throat felt impossibly tight. I should be. But you're not. Taemin reached up slowly and brushed a strand of hair away from her face, his tattooed fingers gentle against her skin. And that terrifies me more than anything else in my life. Why? Because it means you see me, he said softly. Not the reputation, not the power, not the empire, just me. And if you decide I'm not worth it, I won't survive that. Zariah stared at him. This man who controlled entire criminal networks and negotiated with politicians and survived violence, most people couldn't imagine. Admitting that she had the power to destroy him more completely than any enemy ever could. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Then don't say anything, Taemin replied. Just know that whatever happens next week, whatever you decide about us, I'm not going anywhere. I'll wait as long as you need. The elevator doors opened behind her. Zariah stepped inside and turned to face him, her heart hammering, her mind spinning with everything she wanted to say and couldn't. Taemin. Go home, Zariah, he said gently. Get some rest. Next week is going to be hell. The doors closed between them, and Zariah rode down to the lobby in silence while her entire world shifted underneath her feet. The review meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. in the main conference room on the 14th floor. Zariah arrived 30 minutes early with her presentation loaded, her notes organized, and her stomach twisted into knots that felt like they might never come undone. She wore a black suit that made her look severe and unforgiving, and she'd pulled her hair back into a tight bun that hurt her scalp but projected exactly the kind of ruthless competence she needed. The conference room filled slowly. Division heads, senior executives, department managers, people who'd spent years navigating corporate politics and protecting their territories and playing games Zariah had never been interested in learning. Adrian arrived 10 minutes before the meeting started. He looked terrible. His suit was wrinkled, his face pale, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept in days. He took a seat near the back of the room and didn't look at Zariah once, but she could feel his presence like a weight pressing against her chest. Then Vanessa walked in. Zariah's hands tightened on her presentation remote. Her cousin wasn't supposed to be here. This was an internal corporate review, and Vanessa didn't work for any of Taemin's companies. But she walked into the conference room like she owned it, wearing an expensive cream dress and holding Adrian's hand like a declaration of war. Zariah forced herself to breathe slowly. The division head, a man in his 50s named Park Jae-sung, who'd built his entire career on knowing whose ass to kiss, stood near the front of the room, looking increasingly nervous. Then Kang Taemin entered. The entire room fell silent instantly. He wore a charcoal suit that looked like it cost more than most people's cars, his white hair perfectly styled, his expression completely unreadable. He didn't acknowledge anyone as he moved to the head of the conference table and sat down with the controlled authority of someone who owned every person in the room. "Let's begin," he said quietly. Zariah stood and walked to the front of the room. Her hands were steady now. Her voice was clear. And when she looked out at the faces staring back at her, some curious, some hostile, some already certain she was about to commit professional suicide, she felt something cold and precise settle into her chest. "Over the past 3 weeks," she began, "my team conducted a comprehensive audit of Division 7's operations, financial performance, and management practices. What we found represents one of the most significant failures in operational integrity this organization has seen in the past 5 years. She clicked to the first slide. Numbers filled the screen, revenue shortfalls, budget overruns, missed targets, client complaints. The data was damning and undeniable. Division 7 has consistently underperformed across every measurable metric for the past 18 months, Zariah continued. Performance data was systematically misrepresented to secure budget approvals. Failures were reassigned to junior staff who lacked the authority to defend themselves. And management created a culture where covering mistakes was prioritized over preventing them. Park Jae-sung shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Adrian stared at the table, like if he looked at it hard enough, he might disappear through it. Zariah clicked to the next slide. Email chains, meeting minutes, approval documents, all with Adrian's name attached. Adrian Cole, as Senior Operations Manager, was directly responsible for performance reporting across all Division 7 initiatives, she said, her voice steady and clinical. Internal records show a pattern of deliberate misrepresentation, including inflated projections, suppressed client complaints, and falsified completion timelines. "That's not true," Adrian said suddenly, his voice loud and desperate in the silent room. Everyone turned to look at him. Zariah met his eyes across the conference table and felt absolutely nothing. "Which part?" she asked calmly. "All of it." Adrian stood, his face flushed, his hands shaking slightly. "You're twisting everything to make me look bad because you're angry about our personal history." "Our personal history is irrelevant," Zariah replied flatly. "Is it?" Adrian's voice rose. "You've been gunning for me since the moment I married Vanessa. This entire audit is just revenge disguised as due diligence." Murmurs rippled through the room. Zariah clicked to the next slide without breaking eye contact. "Email dated March 15th, she said quietly. From Adrian Cole to Park Jae-sung. Quote, "Client concerns about timeline delays should not be escalated to senior leadership. Reassign responsibility to the logistics coordinator and close the complaint internally." End quote. The room went silent again. "Email dated June 22nd, Zariah continued, clicking through the slides methodically. From Adrian Cole to the Division 7 finance team. Quote, "Adjust Q2 projections upward by 15% to meet budget approval thresholds. Revenue recognition can be corrected in Q3 reporting." End quote. Adrian's face went white. "Performance review dated August 9th, Zariah said, her voice cold and precise. Adrian Cole writes, "Team member Kim Min-jun failed to meet project deadlines due to poor time management. Internal records show Kim Min-jun submitted 17 requests for additional resources that were denied by Adrian Cole directly, and that the project timeline was unrealistic from the beginning." She clicked to the final slide. "This isn't revenge, Adrian," Zariah said quietly. "This is documentation. Everything I'm presenting exists in your own emails, your own reports, your own words. The only thing I did was make sure people actually read them." Adrian stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find words that didn't exist. Then Vanessa stood up. "This is ridiculous," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the silence. "You're all really going to sit here and let her destroy someone's career over a personal grudge?" Taemin's voice cut across the room like a blade. Sit down. 2 words. Quiet. Absolute. Vanessa froze. This is a closed corporate review, Taemin continued, his dark eyes locked on Vanessa with the kind of cold fury that made people disappear in the middle of the night. You are not an employee of this organization. You have no authority here. And if you speak again without permission, security will escort you out. Vanessa's face flushed with humiliation, but she sat down slowly. Taemin turned his attention to Park Jae-sung. You knew about this, he said flatly. Park's face went gray. Sir, You knew Adrian Cole was falsifying reports, and you covered for him because his wife's family has business connections you wanted to protect, Taemin interrupted. That's not strategic. That's corruption. I was trying to maintain operational stability. You were protecting your own position, Taemin cut in coldly. And in doing so, you cost this organization millions of won and damaged our credibility with clients who trusted us. He stood slowly, and the entire room seemed to shrink around him. Adrian Cole is terminated effective immediately, Taemin said quietly. Park Jae-sung, you have 48 hours to submit your resignation, or I will remove you myself and make sure every company in Seoul knows why. Division 7 will be restructured under new leadership by the end of the month. He looked at Zariah. Ms. Monroe will oversee the transition personally. The room erupted in whispers. Adrian stood there looking like someone had ripped the floor out from underneath him, his career destroyed in less than 30 minutes, and all he could do was stare at Zariah like she was a stranger he didn't recognize. You did this, he said hoarsely. You destroyed me. Zariah looked at the man she'd spent 5 years loving and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. No, Adrian, she replied quietly. You destroyed yourself. I just made sure everyone saw it. She gathered her presentation materials and walked out of the conference room while chaos erupted behind her. Zariah made it to the women's bathroom on the 12th floor before her hands started shaking. She locked herself in a stall and sat down on the closed toilet seat, her breath coming in short gasps, her pulse hammering against her ribs. She'd done it. She'd stood in front of an entire room of powerful people and destroyed Adrian's career with nothing but facts and evidence, and the cold precision she'd spent years perfecting. And it felt... She didn't know how it felt. Victorious, terrifying, hollow, all of it at once. Someone knocked on the bathroom door. Occupied, Zariah called out, her voice steadier than she expected. I know. Taemin's voice came through the door, quiet and certain. Open it anyway. Zariah's breath caught. You can't be in here. I own the building, Taemin replied. I can be wherever I want. She stood slowly and unlocked the stall door. Taemin was standing in the middle of the women's bathroom like it was the most natural thing in the world, his suit jacket gone, his sleeves rolled up, his white hair slightly disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it. How did you know I was here? Zariah asked quietly. Because I know you. Taemin moved closer, his dark eyes searching her face. Are you okay? I don't know. That's fair. They stood there in silence for a long moment while fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and Zariah tried to figure out if she'd just committed professional suicide or professional murder or something in between. I need you to tell me the truth, she said finally. About what? Did you give me this assignment because you knew it would destroy him? Taemin didn't hesitate. Yes. The admission should have horrified her. Instead, it felt like relief. Why? Zariah asked. Because he used you, Taemin replied quietly. He took everything you gave him and threw it away the moment it became inconvenient. And then he married your cousin and expected you to smile and pretend it didn't matter. He paused. I wanted him to understand what it costs to underestimate you. That's not justice, Zariah whispered. That's revenge. Justice is what powerful people call revenge when they're the ones dispensing it, Taemin said softly. And you're powerful now, Zariah, whether you're ready to accept that or not. Zariah looked at him, this dangerous man who controlled Seoul's underworld and somehow saw her more clearly than anyone ever had. What happens now? She asked. Taemin reached out slowly and took her hand, his tattooed fingers warm against her skin. Now, he said quietly, you decide who you want to be. And standing in that bathroom while the building hummed around them and Seoul continued spinning outside, Zariah realized she'd already made her choice the moment she walked into that conference room. She wasn't the woman who made herself smaller anymore. She was the woman who burned everything down and built something stronger from the ashes. And she wasn't afraid of that anymore. The first 72 hours after the review meeting felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. Adrian's termination hit Seoul's corporate gossip networks like a bomb. Whispered conversations in coffee shops, speculation on industry message boards, carefully worded inquiries from competitors wondering if Taemin's organization was destabilizing. Park Jae-sung submitted his resignation 18 hours before the deadline, accompanied by a carefully crafted statement about pursuing new opportunities that fooled absolutely nobody. And Zariah became the most talked-about woman in Gangnam's business district practically overnight. Some people called her ruthless. Others called her brilliant. A few called her a vindictive bitch who'd weaponized an audit to destroy her ex-boyfriend's career. Zariah stopped reading the speculation after the first day because none of it mattered, and all of it was probably at least partially true. She threw herself into restructuring Division 7 with the kind of manic focus that made sleep optional and meals forgettable. She fired 3 more managers who'd been complicit in Adrian's failures, promoted 2 junior analysts who actually understood operational efficiency, and personally rewrote the entire division's performance framework from the ground up. Taemin watched from a distance, not hovering, not interfering, just present in the way powerful men were present when they wanted you to know they were paying attention. He sent food to her office when she worked past midnight. He approved every personnel change she recommended without question. And he didn't mention his confession again, giving her space to process everything that had happened without the additional pressure of deciding what she felt about the most dangerous man in Seoul, admitting he was in love with her. It should have been perfect. But 3 weeks after the review meeting, Zariah started noticing things that didn't quite fit. Small things at first. Discrepancies in financial transfers that should have been straightforward. Approval signatures on documents that looked correct but felt wrong. Revenue streams that flowed through Division 7's accounts, but originated from sources she didn't recognize. She told herself she was being paranoid. Division 7 had been mismanaged for 18 months. Of course, there would be irregularities that took time to untangle. Of course, the financial records would be messy. That's what happened when incompetent people ran operations without oversight. But the feeling wouldn't go away. So one Thursday night, alone in her office while the rest of the building slept around her, Zariah started digging deeper. She pulled transaction records going back 2 years, cross-referenced approval chains, traced money movements through subsidiary accounts and shell companies, and the kind of deliberately complicated financial architecture that existed for exactly one reason: to hide something. And what she found made her blood run cold. Division 7 wasn't just poorly managed, it was a pipeline. A carefully constructed conduit moving money from Taemin's legitimate business operations into his criminal empire, laundering funds through fake contracts, inflated invoices, and phantom consulting fees that existed only on paper. The division's consistent underperformance wasn't incompetence, it was camouflage. Adrian had been a useful idiot, too mediocre to notice what was happening under his own authority, and too desperate to keep his position to ask uncomfortable questions. Park Jae-sung had been the architect, building the entire structure and using Adrian as cover. And when Zariah restructured everything, she'd accidentally exposed the pipeline to scrutiny it was never designed to withstand. She sat in her dark office staring at spreadsheets full of evidence while her heart hammered against her ribs and her mind raced through implications that felt like falling down stairs in the dark. Taemin had to know. This was his organization, his empire, his money being moved through channels he'd personally approved. There was no way something this systematic, this deliberate, existed without his explicit knowledge and consent. Which meant Zariah's hands started shaking, which meant he'd sent her into Division 7 knowing exactly what she'd find, knowing she'd tear apart the operational structure, knowing she'd expose the laundering pipeline to internal audit scrutiny. But why? The question circled her brain like a predator looking for weakness. Why would Taemin deliberately sabotage his own money laundering operation? Why risk exposing criminal activity to corporate oversight? Why put someone as thorough as Zariah in a position where she'd inevitably discover evidence that could destroy him? Unless, the thought hit her like a fist to the stomach, unless the exposure was the point. Unless he needed Division 7 to collapse publicly so he could rebuild it into something cleaner, more defensible, less vulnerable to the kind of investigation that could bring down his entire empire. Unless Adrian's termination and Park's resignation weren't revenge at all, but strategic elimination of witnesses who knew too much about how the pipeline actually worked. Unless Zariah had just been a weapon he'd aimed at his own organization and fired without telling her what she was really shooting at. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, her breath coming in short gasps. She needed to talk to Taemin. She needed to hear him explain why he'd used her like this. Her office door opened. Taemin stood in the doorway wearing dark slacks and a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his white hair catching the dim light from the hallway. He looked at her across the darkened office, at the spreadsheets glowing on her computer screen, at the expression on her face that probably told him everything he needed to know. "You found it," he said quietly. Not a question. A confirmation. Zariah's hands curled into fists at her sides. "How long have you known I would?" "Since the beginning." Taemin stepped into the office and closed the door behind him, and suddenly the room felt smaller, the air thinner. "I knew the moment you started the audit you'd find the pipeline eventually. You're too thorough not to." "And you didn't think to warn me?" "No." The answer was so blunt, so unapologetic, that Zariah actually laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that hurt her throat. "Why?" she demanded. "Why send me in there blind? Why let me restructure an entire division without telling me I was dismantling your own money laundering operation?" "Because I needed someone I could trust to do it correctly," Taemin replied, his voice calm and measured. "And I needed you to approach it like a legitimate business problem, not a criminal enterprise cleanup." "That's not an answer." "Yes, it is." Taemin moved closer, and Zariah resisted the urge to step back. Division 7 was compromised. Park Jae-sung had been skimming funds for 2 years, hiding it inside the operational chaos Adrian created. The pipeline was bleeding money and attracting attention from financial regulators I couldn't control. "So you sacrificed it," Zariah said flatly. "I restructured it," Taemin corrected, using the best analyst I had to make sure it was done thoroughly enough that no one would look twice at the remains. Zariah stared at him, this man who'd told her he loved her 3 weeks ago, and now stood in her office admitting he'd manipulated her into cleaning up his criminal empire without her knowledge or consent. "You used me," she said quietly. "Yes. You lied to me." "I withheld information," Taemin replied. "There's a difference." "No, there isn't." Zariah's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "You knew exactly what I'd do if I knew the truth. You knew I'd refuse or demand full transparency or insist on legal oversight, so you just didn't tell me and let me stumble into it blind." "Would you have preferred I left the pipeline intact?" Taemin asked, his tone sharpening slightly. "Let Park continue stealing from me while Adrian's incompetence attracted regulatory attention that could have brought down my entire corporate structure? I would have preferred you trusted me enough to tell me the truth." "I do trust you," Taemin said quietly. "That's why I gave you the assignment." "That's not trust," Zariah shot back. "That's control disguised as respect. You didn't trust me to make the right choice. You just trusted me to be competent enough to execute your plan without understanding what I was really doing." Taemin's jaw tightened. "You're oversimplifying." "Am I?" Zariah moved around her desk, closing the distance between them until she could see the faint scar through his eyebrow and the absolute certainty in his dark eyes. "Tell me something. When you gave me this job 3 months ago, was it because you valued my intelligence? Or because you were already planning to use me to clean up your mess?" Taemin was silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Both." The admission landed like a blade between ribs. Zariah took a step back, her chest tight, her hands shaking. "Get out." "Zariah, I said get out." Her voice broke slightly, and she hated herself for it. "You've been planning this since the wedding garden, since the moment you gave me that business card. You saw someone desperate and angry, and you knew exactly how to weaponize it." "That's not true," Taemin said, and for the first time since she'd known him, his composure cracked slightly. "I saw someone brilliant and undervalued, and I wanted—" "You wanted a tool," Zariah interrupted. "Someone smart enough to execute your plans and naive enough not to ask the right questions until it was too late to matter." "No. Then what?" Zariah demanded. "What am I to you, Taemin? Really? Strip away all the pretty words about respect and capability and tell me what I actually am in your world. Taemin looked at her like she'd just asked him to cut out his own heart. You're everything, he said hoarsely. Liar. I'm not. He stopped, running a hand through his white hair in frustration. I'm not lying. I love you. I've loved you since the moment I watched you stand up in that boardroom 4 years ago and tell a room full of powerful men they were wrong. Everything I've done since then has been trying to bring you close enough to see if you could actually survive in my world. By lying to me, Zariah said flatly. By protecting you, Taemin corrected. Do you have any idea what happens to people in my organization who know too much about the criminal side? They become liabilities. They get watched constantly. They lose the ability to move freely, to make independent choices, to exist outside the empire. So you just decided to keep me ignorant? I decided to keep you clean, Taemin replied. As long as you didn't know what you were really restructuring, you had plausible deniability. You were just a consultant doing her job. Nothing illegal. Nothing traceable. If regulatory investigators ever came asking questions, you could answer honestly and walk away untouched. Zariah stared at him, her mind racing through the implications. He'd been protecting her, in the most manipulative, controlling, paternalistic way possible, but protecting her nonetheless. That wasn't your choice to make, she said quietly. I know. I deserve to know the truth. You're right, Taemin agreed. But I couldn't risk losing you before you understood what we could be together. And if I'd told you the truth from the beginning, you would have run. You don't know that. Yes, I do. Taemin's voice was gentle now, almost sad. Because you're smart and careful, and you don't make stupid decisions. And getting involved with a man who runs a criminal empire is objectively the stupidest decision you could possibly make. He wasn't wrong. Zariah hated that he wasn't wrong. She sank down into her desk chair, her legs suddenly unsteady, and stared at the spreadsheet still glowing on her computer screen, evidence of money laundering, criminal conspiracy, organizational fraud, evidence that could destroy Taemin's empire if it reached the wrong hands, evidence she now possessed. What happens now? She asked quietly. Taemin moved to the window, his back to her, staring out at Seoul's night skyline. That depends on you. Don't put this on me. It's already on you, Taemin replied without turning around. You found the evidence. You understand what it means. And now you have to decide what you're going to do with that knowledge. Zariah's stomach twisted. You think I'm going to report you? I think you should, Taemin said quietly. I think you should take everything you found, walk it straight to the Financial Supervisory Service, and destroy me before I destroy you. I'm not going to... Why not? Taemin turned to face her now, his expression raw and honest in a way she'd never seen before. I lied to you. I manipulated you. I used your intelligence and your anger and your desire to prove yourself as weapons against an organization you didn't even know you were attacking. You should hate me for that. Maybe I do, Zariah whispered. Then prove it, Taemin challenged. Turn me in. Testify against me. Watch my empire collapse and know you were the one strong enough to burn it down. The words hung in the air between them, like something living and dangerous. Zariah stood slowly, her hands braced against her desk, her mind spinning through possibilities that all felt equally impossible. She could report him, take the evidence to regulators, and watch Kang Taemin's entire criminal empire implode from the inside. She'd be protected. Whistleblower immunity, witness protection if necessary, a clean exit from a world that had already cost her more than she'd realized. Or she could stay silent, delete the evidence, pretend she never found it, continue working for a man who loved her enough to try protecting her, but not enough to trust her with the truth. Both options felt like different versions of the same betrayal. I need time, she said finally. How much? I don't know. Zariah looked at him across the office. This dangerous man who controlled Seoul's underworld and somehow looked more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. But I can't be here right now. I can't look at you and think clearly. Taemin nodded slowly. Take as long as you need. And if I decide to walk away, then I'll let you go, Taemin replied quietly. No threats, no consequences, no revenge. You'll disappear and I'll make sure no one from my world ever touches you. You can't promise that. Yes, I can, Taemin said, because I love you more than I love my empire. And if you decide I'm not worth the cost, I'll respect that choice even if it kills me. Zariah grabbed her jacket and laptop bag, shoving files and personal belongings inside with shaking hands. She needed air. She needed space. She needed to be anywhere that wasn't this office with this man who'd just admitted he'd been manipulating her since the moment they met. She walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the handle. "Did you mean it?" she asked without turning around. "What you said in the elevator 3 weeks ago about being in love with me?" "Yes, even though you were already planning to use me?" "I didn't plan to fall in love with you," Taemin said quietly. "That just happened, and it complicated everything." Zariah opened the door. "Goodbye, Taemin." She walked out before he could respond. Zariah spent the next 4 days alone in her apartment, barely eating, barely sleeping, and definitely not making rational decisions about what to do with evidence that could destroy the most powerful criminal organization in Seoul. She stared at her laptop screen until her eyes burned. She paced her small living room until her feet ached. She made coffee she didn't drink and lists of pros and cons that all felt equally meaningless when measured against the weight of actually choosing. On the 5th day, Vanessa showed up at her door. Zariah almost didn't answer, but her cousin knocked persistently enough that ignoring her became more annoying than just dealing with whatever fresh hell she'd brought. "What do you want?" Zariah asked, opening the door just wide enough to make her lack of welcome obvious. Vanessa looked different than she had at the review meeting. Smaller somehow. Her expensive clothes looked wrong on her, like she was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit anymore. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her carefully maintained polish had cracked around the edges. "Can I come in?" Vanessa asked quietly. "No. Please, Zariah, I need to talk to you." "We have nothing to talk about." "Adrian's gone," Vanessa blurted out. Zariah froze. "What?" "He left." Vanessa's voice cracked slightly. 3 days ago, just packed his things and disappeared. He won't answer my calls. His phone goes straight to voicemail. I went to his mother's house and she said she hasn't heard from him. I don't know what you expect me to do about that." "I expect you to have some basic human decency," Vanessa snapped, some of her old venom returning. "You destroyed his career. You humiliated him in front of everyone who mattered. And now he's gone and I don't know where he is or if he's okay, and you're the only person who might actually know what he's planning." Zariah stared at her cousin, this woman who'd spent their entire lives taking things that didn't belong to her, and felt absolutely nothing. "Adrian made his own choices," Zariah said flatly. "He lied about performance data. He blamed other people for his failures. He built a career on connections instead of competence. I didn't destroy him. I just documented what he'd already done to himself." "You think you're so much better than everyone else," Vanessa said bitterly. "You think being smart gives you the right to ruin people's lives." "I think being honest gives me the right not to cover for people's incompetence," Zariah corrected. "Something you've never understood." Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. "I loved him." "No, you didn't," Zariah replied quietly. "You loved winning. You loved taking something that belonged to me and making it yours. But you never actually loved Adrian. If you did, you would have noticed he was failing long before I documented it." "That's not fair." "Nothing about this is fair, Vanessa." Zariah's voice hardened. "You spent our entire childhood taking things from me and expecting me to smile and forgive you. My toys, my achievements, my opportunities. And when you took Adrian, you expected the same thing, that I'd just accept it and move on and pretend it didn't matter." "I didn't take him," Vanessa protested weakly. "He chose me." "Because you were easier," Zariah said bluntly. "Because you didn't challenge him or expect him to be better or remind him of everything he wasn't. You were convenient, and now that convenience has consequences." Vanessa stood in the hallway looking lost and small and nothing like the confident woman who'd whispered cruelty at a wedding reception 4 months ago. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," Zariah replied, but it's not my problem anymore." She closed the door in her cousin's face and stood in her apartment listening to Vanessa's footsteps fade down the hallway while something cold and final settled in her chest. She'd burned every bridge back to her old life. Adrian was gone. Vanessa was destroyed. Her entire past had been systematically dismantled until nothing remained except the choice standing directly in front of her. Stay in Taemin's world knowing he'd manipulated her, or walk away. and lose the only person who'd ever seen her strength as something valuable instead of threatening. Neither option felt like winning. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at the Han River. Yowido Park, midnight. Come alone." Zariah stared at the message, her pulse quickening. This was a terrible idea. Meeting unknown contacts at midnight was how people got murdered in crime dramas. But something about the message felt urgent, important, like whoever sent it knew something she desperately needed to know. She grabbed her jacket. Yowido Park was nearly empty at midnight, just a few late-night joggers and couples walking along the river path while cold winds swept across the water and made the city lights shimmer like something unstable. Zariah walked slowly toward the designated meeting spot near the fountain, her hands shoved deep in her jacket pockets, her senses hyper-alert for anything that felt wrong. A man emerged from the shadows near the trees, tall, lean, expensive suit. 40s, maybe, with sharp features and eyes that looked like they'd seen things most people only survived in nightmares. "Zariah Monroe," he said quietly. Not a question. "Who are you?" "My name is Lee Sung-min." He moved closer but maintained careful distance, like he understood she was 2 seconds from running. "I work for the Financial Supervisory Service, Anti-Corruption Division." Zariah's stomach dropped. "How did you find me?" "We've been watching Kang Taemin's organization for 3 years, Lee replied. "Money laundering, fraud, criminal conspiracy. We know Division 7 was a pipeline, and we know you just tore it apart without understanding what you were really doing." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." Lee's voice was gentle but firm. "You found the evidence, transaction records, approval chains, shell companies, everything we'd need to build a prosecution case that would finally put Taemin behind bars where he belongs." Zariah took a step back. "I'm not involved in whatever you think I'm involved in." "You're more involved than anyone," Lee said quietly, "and you're in danger because of it. The moment Taemin realizes you have evidence that could destroy him, you become a liability, and liabilities don't survive long in his world." "He wouldn't hurt me. Are you sure about that?" Lee tilted his head slightly. "Because 4 months ago he put you in a position to dismantle his own money laundering operation without telling you the truth. That's not protection, Ms. Monroe. That's strategic manipulation from someone who values control more than honesty." The words landed too close to her own thoughts. "What do you want from me?" Zariah asked. "Testimony," Lee replied simply. "Everything you found about Division 7, full cooperation with our investigation. In exchange, we'll give you complete immunity and protection from retaliation. And if I refuse, then you go back to working for a man who's been lying to you since the day you met him," Lee said quietly. "And eventually, maybe tomorrow, maybe next month, maybe next year, he'll decide you know too much, and you'll disappear like everyone else who became inconvenient to Kang Taemin's empire." Zariah's hands were shaking now, her breath visible in the cold night air. "I need time to think." "You have 24 hours, Lee said. He held out a business card. "After that, the offer expires and you're on your own." Zariah took the card with numb fingers. Lee started to walk away, then stopped and turned back. "One more thing," he said quietly. "We know about Park Jae-sung, how he submitted his resignation right before the deadline, how he disappeared 2 days later. He said he was pursuing new opportunities. His body was found in Incheon Harbor yesterday morning," Lee interrupted. "Single gunshot wound, execution style, the kind of cleanup Taemin's organization does when someone becomes a liability." The world tilted sideways. Zariah grabbed the fountain ledge to stay upright while her mind raced through implications that felt like drowning. Park was dead, murdered, eliminated because he knew too much about the money laundering operation Zariah had just spent 3 weeks tearing apart. "Think carefully about your choice, Miss Monroe," Lee said softly, "because the next body they find in that harbor might be yours." He walked away into the darkness, leaving Zariah standing alone beside the Han River, while Seoul glowed cold and indifferent around her, and the weight of everything she'd discovered threatened to crush her completely. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands. One call. One choice. Report Taemin and destroy the man who claimed to love her. Or stay silent and become the next liability his empire needed to eliminate. Either way, the woman she'd been 4 months ago, the woman who believed intelligence and hard work were enough to survive, was already dead. Now she just had to decide who she was going to become next. Zariah didn't go home. She walked along the Han River for 2 hours while the city slept around her and Lee Sung-min's business card burned like acid in her jacket pocket. The temperature had dropped below freezing, but she barely felt it. Her mind was racing too fast, her thoughts spiraling through implications that all led to the same terrifying conclusion. Park Jae-sung was dead, murdered, executed because he knew too much about the money laundering operation she'd spent 3 weeks dismantling. And if Taemin could eliminate Park that easily, that quickly, that permanently, what was stopping him from doing the same to her? She pulled out her phone at 3 in the morning and stared at Taemin's contact for a long time before finally typing a message. "We need to talk. Now." The response came back in less than 30 seconds. "My penthouse. I'll be waiting." Zariah took the subway to Gangnam even though the trains were nearly empty at this hour, sitting in a bright fluorescent car next to sleeping salarymen and college students coming home from all-night study sessions. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that the woman sitting 3 seats away was carrying evidence that could destroy Seoul's most powerful criminal empire. She walked into Taemin's building at 4 in the morning and took the private elevator to the 15th floor while her heart hammered against her ribs, and her hands shook so badly she had to shove them in her pockets to keep them still. The elevator doors opened. Taemin stood near the windows overlooking the city, still wearing the same clothes from earlier. Dark slacks, white dress shirt, sleeves rolled up. He looked like he hadn't slept. He looked like he'd been waiting for this conversation since the moment she walked out of her office 5 days ago. "You found out about Park," he said quietly without turning around. Not a question, a statement. Zariah stepped into the penthouse and let the elevator doors close behind her. "Did you kill him?" "No." "Did you order it?" Taemin turned to face her now, his expression unreadable. "Does it matter?" "Yes," Zariah said, her voice shaking. "It matters to me whether the man who claims to love me is also a murderer." "I've killed people before," Taemin replied calmly. "Not Park, but others. Men who threatened my organization, men who betrayed me, men who thought they could take what was mine and walk away untouched." He paused. "Does that change how you feel about me?" Zariah's throat felt impossibly tight. "I don't know." "Then let me make it easier for you." Taemin moved closer, and even now, even knowing what he was capable of, some part of Zariah wanted to close the distance between them instead of running. "Park was stealing from me for 2 years, skimming funds, hiding it inside Adrian's operational chaos. When I restructured Division 7, he panicked, started making calls to competitors, offering to sell information about my organization in exchange for protection." "So you had him killed?" "I had him removed," Taemin corrected. "There's a difference. I didn't pull the trigger. I didn't give the order directly. But I knew what would happen when I told my people he'd become a liability, and I didn't stop it." The admission hung in the air between them like something toxic. Zariah took a step back, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "How am I supposed to trust you after this?" "You're not," Taemin said quietly. "That's the point. You're supposed to understand exactly what my world costs and decide if you're strong enough to survive it. And if I'm not, then you walk away." Taemin's voice was gentle now, almost sad. "Take the evidence you found. Give it to whoever met you at the river tonight. Yes, I know about Lee Sung-min. I've had surveillance on you since the moment you left this building 5 days ago. And destroy me. I won't stop you." Zariah stared at him, her mind reeling. "You've been watching me." "Of course I have," Taemin replied. "You're carrying evidence that could dismantle my entire empire. Did you really think I'd just let you wander around Seoul without protection?" "Protection or surveillance?" "Both." Taemin moved closer again, close enough now that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. "I have men stationed outside your apartment, following you on the subway, watching every person who comes within 10 feet of you. Because if Lee Sung-min knows about Division 7, then other people know too. Competitors, enemies, people who would love nothing more than to get their hands on someone who could testify against me." "So you're protecting me," Zariah said flatly, "by making me a prisoner." "I'm protecting you by making sure you survive long enough to make an actual choice," Taemin corrected. instead of getting murdered in your sleep by someone who wants to use you as leverage against me." The words should have terrified her. Instead, they just made her angry. "You don't get to make that decision for me," Zariah said, her voice rising. "You don't get to manipulate me into dismantling your money laundering operation, lie to me about what I was really doing, and then decide I need protection because I found evidence you deliberately led me to." "You're right," Taemin agreed. "I don't get to make those decisions for you, but I'm going to anyway, because keeping you alive matters more to me than respecting your autonomy." "That's not love," Zariah shot back. "That's obsession." "Maybe." Taemin's eyes were dark and steady on hers. "But it's the only kind of love I know how to give. And if you want something different, something healthier, something that doesn't come with surveillance teams and murder and evidence of criminal conspiracy, then you should take Lee Sung-min's offer and walk away while you still can." Zariah wanted to scream. She wanted to hit him. She wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him until he understood that you couldn't claim to love someone while simultaneously controlling every aspect of their existence. Instead, she asked the question that had been burning in her chest since the moment Lee showed her that business card. "If I testify against you, will you have me killed?" Taemin's expression didn't change. "No." "How do I know you're telling the truth?" "You don't," Taemin replied quietly. "You just have to decide if you trust me more than you fear me." And that was the problem, wasn't it? Because standing in Taemin's penthouse at 4 in the morning with evidence of money laundering burning a hole in her laptop and the memory of Park's execution playing on repeat in her mind, Zariah realized something terrifying. She did trust him, more than she should. More than was rational. More than any sane person would trust a man who ran a criminal empire and admitted to ordering people's deaths. But she trusted him anyway. Because in 4 months of working inside his organization, he'd never once asked her to be smaller. Never demanded she compromise her intelligence, or hide her strength, or pretend to be less capable than she was. He'd lied to her and manipulated her and used her as a weapon against his own empire. But he'd never asked her to be weak, and somehow that mattered more than all the rest of it combined. "I'm not going to testify," Zariah said quietly. Taemin went very still. "Why not?" "Because Lee Sung-min doesn't care about me," Zariah replied. "He cares about taking down your organization, and the moment I give him what he wants, I become disposable. Another witness in protective custody waiting to testify at a trial that might not happen for years. If I'm lucky, I get a new identity and a quiet life somewhere far away from Seoul. If I'm unlucky, someone from your organization finds me first." "That's a possibility," Taemin admitted. "But if I stay here," Zariah continued, her voice gaining strength now, "I know exactly what the danger is. I know who's watching me and why. I know the rules of the world I'm choosing to survive in. And I know you won't kill me because despite everything you've done, you actually meant it when you said you loved me." Taemin's hands were shaking slightly, the first time she'd ever seen him lose his composure completely. "You're making a mistake," he said hoarsely. "Probably," Zariah agreed. "But it's my mistake to make. Not yours. Not Lee Sung-min's. Mine." She pulled out her laptop and opened it on Taemin's desk, navigating to the folder where she'd stored all the evidence about Division 7's money laundering operation. Transaction records, approval chains, shell company registrations, everything the Financial Supervisory Service would need to build a prosecution case. Then she selected all of it and dragged it to the trash. "What are you doing?" Taemin asked quietly. "Choosing you," Zariah replied. "Even though I probably shouldn't. Even though you've lied to me and manipulated me and controlled me in ways I'm still too angry to fully process. I'm choosing you anyway." She emptied the trash. The evidence disappeared. And with it, any chance she had of walking away from Taemin's world without blood on her hands. Taemin crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her like he was trying to hold her together by sheer force of will. His heart was hammering beneath his dress shirt, and his breath was ragged against her hair. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "No," Zariah agreed, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "You really don't. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of this choice." "You better." They stood there in the silent penthouse, while Seoul woke up slowly around them, and the weight of what Zariah had just done settled into her bones like something permanent and irreversible. She'd crossed a line, destroyed evidence, obstructed an investigation, chosen a criminal over justice. And the worst part was she didn't regret it. Not yet, anyway. The next 48 hours moved like a countdown to something inevitable. Zariah went back to work at Division 7 like nothing had changed, restructuring operations and implementing new management protocols while her team whispered about Park's death in break rooms and elevators. The official story was that he'd been killed in a robbery gone wrong. Nobody believed it. But nobody asked questions either, because asking questions about dead people in Taemin's organization was how you became the next dead person. Lee Sung-min called her once. She didn't answer. He left a voicemail that was equal parts threat and promise. 24 hours had passed, the offer of immunity had expired, and now she was officially a person of interest in an ongoing investigation into Kang Taemin's criminal activities. Zariah deleted the message and threw away the business card and pretended her hands weren't shaking. Taemin worked from his penthouse, conducting business through encrypted calls and secure video conferences. And every night, Zariah showed up at his door, and they ate dinner together like two people attempting normalcy in a world that had nothing to do with normal. They didn't talk about Park. They didn't talk about the deleted evidence. They didn't talk about the fact that Zariah had just made herself complicit in covering up a murder and obstruction of a federal investigation. Instead, they talked about books and movies and childhood memories and all the safe topics people discussed when they were trying very hard not to acknowledge that the foundation beneath their relationship was built on lies and violence and choices that couldn't be unmade. On the third night, Taemin cooked. Actually cooked. Not ordering delivery or having food brought in from expensive restaurants, but standing in his gleaming kitchen making kimchi jjigae from scratch, while Zariah sat at the counter drinking wine and watching him move through the space with the same precision he brought to everything else. "Where did you learn to cook?" she asked. "My mother," Taemin replied without looking up from the pot. "Before she died. She said men who couldn't feed themselves were useless." "How old were you?" 12. Zariah's chest tightened. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." Taemin tasted the stew and added more gochugaru. She was right, and cooking is one of the few things in my life that's still completely honest. You put in ingredients, you follow steps, you get results. No manipulation, no strategy, just cause and effect. "Is that what you want?" Zariah asked quietly. "Honesty?" Taemin finally looked at her, his dark eyes steady. "From you? Yes, always. Even when it hurts? Especially then." Zariah set down her wine glass carefully. "I'm still angry at you." "I know. And I don't know if I can ever fully trust you again after what you did." "I know that too," Taemin said. "But I'm choosing to stay anyway," Zariah continued, "because somehow, despite everything, I think you might be the only person in my entire life who's ever seen me as something more than a problem to be managed or a threat to be contained." Taemin turned off the stove and moved around the counter until he was standing directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the faint scar through his eyebrow and the exhaustion in his expression. "You're not a problem," he said quietly. "You're the solution to one I didn't even know I had." "What problem?" "Loneliness," Taemin replied. "The kind that comes from being powerful enough that everyone either fears you or wants something from you. I've spent 20 years surrounded by people and completely alone. Until you." Zariah reached up slowly and touched his face, her fingers gentle against the sharp line of his jaw. "This is insane," she whispered. "I know. We're going to destroy each other." "Probably," Taemin agreed, "but I'd rather burn with you than survive alone." He kissed her then. Not gently, not carefully, but with the desperate intensity of someone who'd been holding back for months and finally had permission to stop. Zariah kissed him back just as fiercely, her hands fisting in his shirt, her body pressing against his like she was trying to climb inside his skin. They didn't make it to the bedroom. They barely made it to the couch. And afterward, lying tangled together while Seoul glowed through the floor-to-ceiling windows and their breathing slowly returned to normal, Zariah realized something that should have terrified her but somehow didn't. She'd fallen in love with a monster, and she didn't care anymore. Sarat. The raid happened at 6 in the morning on a Thursday. Zariah was still asleep in Taemin's penthouse when her phone started vibrating violently across the nightstand. She grabbed it blindly, her eyes barely open, and saw 15 missed calls from members of her Division 7 team. Then she saw the news alert. Financial Supervisory Service raids Gangnam corporate offices. Kang Taemin Empire. Under investigation. She sat up so fast her head spun. Taemin was already awake, standing near the windows fully dressed in a dark suit, his phone pressed to his ear while he spoke rapid Korean to someone on the other end. When he saw Zariah looking at him, he ended the call. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad," Taemin replied. They hit 6 locations simultaneously: corporate headquarters, Division 7 offices, 3 subsidiary companies. They have warrants for financial records, computer systems, personnel files. Lee Sung-min. Yes. Taemin's voice was flat, emotionless. He must have had enough evidence to convince a judge to approve the raids even without your testimony. Zariah's stomach dropped. Park's records. Probably, Taemin agreed. Or someone else inside the organization decided cooperating was safer than staying loyal. He moved to his desk and started pulling files from drawers, documents that looked important and highly illegal, and fed them into an industrial shredder that turned everything into confetti in seconds. "What are you doing?" Zariah asked. "Destroying anything they can use against me," Taemin replied calmly. "The raids are happening now, which means I have maybe 30 minutes before they get a warrant for this penthouse too. I need to sanitize everything before they arrive." "They're coming here?" "Eventually." Taemin looked at her across the room, his expression serious. "Which means you need to leave. Now. Before they find you here and start asking questions about why the lead analyst on the Division 7 restructuring is sleeping in the penthouse of the man she was supposedly investigating." Zariah stood quickly, grabbing her clothes from where they'd been discarded the night before. "What happens to you?" "I have lawyers," Taemin said. "Good ones, expensive ones. They'll delay everything, challenge the warrants, tie the investigation up in procedural battles for months, maybe years. And if that doesn't work?" Taemin stopped shredding documents and looked at her with absolute calm. "Then I go to prison and my empire collapses and everyone who ever depended on me for protection becomes vulnerable to whoever takes my place." The words landed like a physical blow. Zariah finished dressing with shaking hands and grabbed her phone and laptop, shoving everything into her bag while her mind raced through implications that all felt catastrophic. "This is my fault," she said quietly. "If I hadn't restructured Division 7, this was always going to happen," Taemin interrupted. "Lee Sung-min has been building a case against me for 3 years. You didn't create the problem, you just accelerated the timeline." "That's not comforting." "It's not supposed to be," Taemin replied. "It's just the truth." Zariah moved toward the elevator, then stopped and turned back. "What do you need me to do?" Taemin looked at her like she'd just offered to cut out her own heart and hand it to him. "Survive," he said quietly. "Whatever happens next, I need you to survive it." "That's not an answer." "Yes, it is." Taemin crossed the distance between them and took her face in his hands, his tattooed fingers gentle against her skin. "If they arrest me, don't visit, don't write, don't contact my lawyers. Disappear completely and let everyone think we were just professional colleagues. That's the only way you stay clean." "I'm not clean," Zariah whispered. "Not anymore." "You're cleaner than me," Taemin replied, "and that's all that matters." He kissed her hard and fast, like he was trying to memorize the taste of her, and then he stepped back and gestured toward the elevator. "Go," he said, "before I change my mind about letting you leave." Zariah went. She rode the elevator down to the lobby while her heart hammered against her ribs and her mind screamed at her to go back upstairs, to stay with Taemin, to face whatever was coming together instead of running. But she kept walking. Through the lobby, out onto the street, into the Seoul morning where sirens were already wailing in the distance and black SUVs with government plates were pulling up outside corporate buildings across Gangnam. She made it 3 blocks before someone grabbed her arm. Zariah spun around, her pulse spiking, and found herself face to face with Lee Sung-min. He looked exactly the same as he had at the Han River. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, the expression of someone who'd just won a game that had been rigged against him from the start. "Miss Monroe," he said pleasantly, "we need to talk." "I have nothing to say to you." "That's unfortunate," Lee replied, "because I have a lot to say to you. Starting with the fact that we found evidence of systematic evidence destruction on your work computer, deleted files, cleared browser history, transaction records that were accessed, and then permanently erased 3 days ago. Zariah's blood turned to ice. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, Lee said calmly. And here's what's going to happen. You're going to come with me to our field office. You're going to sit in an interview room, and you're going to explain exactly why you deleted evidence of money laundering from a computer system belonging to an organization currently under federal investigation. And if I refuse? Lee's smile was cold and professional. Then I arrest you right here for obstruction of justice and criminal conspiracy, and you spend the next several years in prison alongside Kang Taemin, watching your life get dismantled piece by piece. Zariah stared at him while Seoul moved around them. Early commuters flooding the subway, coffee shops opening their doors, the city waking up completely unaware that the woman standing on the sidewalk was about to make a choice that would determine whether she survived the next 24 hours. I want a lawyer, she said finally. Smart choice, Lee replied. He gestured to an unmarked car parked at the curb, and Zariah Monroe, the woman who'd spent 5 years being too much for weak men, who'd destroyed her ex-boyfriend's career with nothing but facts and ruthless precision, who'd fallen in love with Seoul's most dangerous criminal and chosen him over justice, climbed into the back seat and let herself be driven toward a future that looked nothing like anything she'd ever planned. Behind her, somewhere in a penthouse overlooking the city, Kang Taemin was destroying evidence and preparing for war. And ahead of her, inside a government building where fluorescent lights never stopped buzzing and interview rooms smelled like fear and desperation, Lee Sung-min was preparing to break her completely. The only question left was which man would win, and whether Zariah would survive long enough to see the answer. The interview room was exactly what Zariah expected. Windowless, claustrophobic, and deliberately designed to make people feel small. A metal table bolted to the floor. 2 chairs that looked like they'd survived decades of interrogations. Fluorescent lights that hummed with the persistent buzz of insects trapped behind glass. Lee Sung-min sat across from her holding a manila folder thick with documents, his expression professionally neutral in the way government investigators perfected after years of breaking people who thought they were smarter than the system. Zariah's lawyer sat beside her, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s named Jung Mi-kyung, who'd arrived within 30 minutes of Zariah's phone call and immediately instructed her not to say anything until she'd reviewed the evidence against her. That had been 4 hours ago. Now it was almost noon and Lee was finally ready to begin. Let's start with something simple, he said, opening the folder. When did you first become aware that Division 7 was being used as a money laundering pipeline? My client has no obligation to answer that question, Jung said immediately. Lee didn't even glance at her. We have forensic evidence showing that files related to Division 7's financial operations were accessed from your work computer on multiple occasions over the past month. We also have evidence that those same files were permanently deleted 3 days ago using professional-grade data destruction software. Accessing files as part of a corporate restructuring assignment is not a crime, Jung replied calmly. Deleting evidence during a federal investigation is, Lee countered. He slid a document across the table toward Zariah. This is a data recovery report from our digital forensics team. They were able to reconstruct portions of the deleted files, transaction records, shell company registrations, approval chains showing systematic money movement through fake consulting fees and inflated invoices. Zariah looked at the document without touching it. Lee continued, What's interesting is the timing. You deleted these files the same day Park Jae-sung's body was found in Incheon Harbor. That's quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say? My client had no knowledge of Mr. Park's death, Jung said firmly. Are you sure about that? Lee pulled out another document, a surveillance photo showing Zariah standing beside the Han River at midnight, talking to someone whose face was deliberately obscured. This was taken 4 days ago, Yeouido Park. You met with someone at midnight and had a conversation that lasted approximately 15 minutes. Care to explain who that was? Zariah's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression blank. Jung leaned forward slightly. Unless you're prepared to charge my client with a specific crime, this interview is over. Obstruction of justice, Lee said quietly. Criminal conspiracy. Accessory after the fact to money laundering. I can charge her with all 3 right now and hold her for 72 hours while we build the case. Or He paused, letting the word hang in the air. She can cooperate. Tell us everything she knows about Kang Taemin's organization. Testify about Division 7's money laundering operation. And in exchange, we'll recommend immunity. We need to speak privately, Young said. Lee stood and left the room without another word. The moment the door closed, Young turned to Zariah with an expression that was equal parts professional concern and barely concealed frustration. Tell me the truth, she said quietly. Did you delete evidence? Zariah looked at her lawyer. This woman who'd been hired to protect her, who had no idea she was defending someone who'd already chosen to stand beside a monster instead of running from one. Yes, Zariah admitted. Young closed her eyes briefly. Why? Because I'm in love with him. That's the stupidest reason I've ever heard. I know, Zariah replied, but it's the truth. Young was silent for a long moment, and then she asked the question that mattered most. Do you want to testify against him? Zariah thought about Taemin standing in his penthouse at 6 a.m. destroying evidence while federal agents raided his entire empire. She thought about the way he'd kissed her before sending her away, like he was trying to memorize something he knew he was about to lose. She thought about 4 months of being seen as powerful instead of threatening, valued instead of feared, chosen instead of tolerated. No, she said quietly. I don't. Jung studied her carefully. Then we have a problem because Lee Sung-min has enough evidence to charge you whether you cooperate or not. The only question is how long you spend in prison and what kind of deal you get. What are my options? Option 1, you cooperate fully, testify against Taemin, accept immunity and witness protection and disappear into a new life where nobody from his organization can ever find you. And option 2, you refuse to cooperate, Jung replied. Lee charges you with obstruction and conspiracy. You go to trial. Best case scenario, you get a reduced sentence because you're a first-time offender who was manipulated by a criminal organization. Worst case, you spend the next 5 to 10 years in prison watching Kang Taemin's empire collapse from the inside of a cell. Neither option sounded like winning. Zariah looked down at her hands. These hands that had restructured an entire division, destroyed Adrian's career, deleted evidence of criminal conspiracy, and chosen a dangerous man over safety. There's a third option, she said slowly. What's that? I tell Lee the truth, Zariah replied. Not about Taemin's criminal operations. About mine. Young's eyebrows lifted. Explain. I deleted the files because I was trying to cover up my own mistakes during the Division 7 restructuring, Zariah said, the lie forming as she spoke. I made errors in the financial analysis that would have reflected badly on my professional reputation. When I realized federal investigators were looking at Division 7, I panicked and destroyed anything that might expose my incompetence. That's still obstruction, Young pointed out. But it's not conspiracy, Zariah countered. It's just a scared consultant trying to protect her career. Lee wants Taemin. He doesn't care about me unless I can help him get what he wants. If I convince him I'm just a useful idiot who accidentally stumbled into a criminal enterprise and then panicked, he loses interest. Young was quiet for a long moment, her sharp eyes studying Zariah's face. That's surprisingly clever, she said finally, and probably your best option given the circumstances. But you need to understand something. If you go this route, you're admitting to destroying evidence. Lee will push for charges. You'll probably face fines, maybe probation, possibly a short jail sentence. But not 10 years. No, Young agreed. Probably not. Zariah took a slow breath. Then let's do it. Chom. The interrogation lasted another 6 hours. Lee pushed hard, circling back to the same questions over and over, trying to find inconsistencies in Zariah's story. But she held firm. She'd made mistakes during the restructuring, panicked when she realized how serious they were, deleted files to protect her reputation. She had no knowledge of money laundering, no knowledge of Park's murder, no knowledge of Taemin's criminal operations beyond the legitimate corporate structure she'd been hired to improve. It was a careful dance between truth and lies, and by the time Lee finally gave up, it was almost midnight, and Zariah felt like she'd been hollowed out from the inside. We're charging you with obstruction, Lee said flatly, as Jung gathered their materials. You'll be arraigned tomorrow morning. Given your cooperation and lack of prior record, I'll recommend supervised release pending trial. What about Kang Taemin? Zariah asked. Lee's expression hardened. We raided 18 locations today, seized financial records, computer systems, and enough evidence to build multiple cases. He's looking at money laundering, fraud, criminal conspiracy, and about a dozen other charges. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison. The words should have brought relief. Instead, they just made Zariah's chest ache. Jung drove her home in silence, the city lights blurring past the car windows while Zariah stared at nothing and tried to process everything that had happened in the past 18 hours. "You know this isn't over," Jung said quietly as they pulled up outside Zariah's apartment building. "I know. Lee is going to keep digging, and eventually he's going to figure out you're lying about something. Maybe not what, but enough to make him suspicious. I'll deal with it when it happens," Zariah replied. Jung looked at her with something that might have been pity, or respect, or exhaustion. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow's going to be brutal." Zariah climbed out of the car and walked into her building, taking the elevator to the 4th floor, while every muscle in her body screamed for rest. She unlocked her apartment door, expecting darkness and silence. Instead, she found Kang Taemin sitting on her couch. He looked terrible. His white hair was disheveled, his suit jacket gone, his dress shirt wrinkled and partially unbuttoned. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands were wrapped in white bandages like he'd hurt them, destroying evidence, or fighting off federal agents, or both. "How did you get in here?" Zariah asked quietly. "I own the building," Taemin replied. "Master keys aren't difficult to acquire." He stood slowly, and Zariah could see the exhaustion in every movement, the weight of 18 federal raids and a collapsing empire pressing down on his shoulders. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "If Lee finds out—" "I don't care about Lee Sung-min," Taemin interrupted. "I care about you. Are you okay?" The question broke something inside her chest. Zariah crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face against his shoulder while he held her like she was the only thing keeping him upright. They stood there in her dark apartment for a long time, breathing together, holding on to each other while the world collapsed around them. "They're going to arrest you," Zariah whispered. "I know. Lee says you're looking at life in prison." "Probably," Taemin agreed, "and you're here anyway." "I needed to see you," Taemin said quietly. "Before everything ends. I needed you to know that what I feel for you isn't strategy or manipulation or some calculated move to keep you loyal. I'm in love with you, completely, destructively, in a way that makes me do stupid things like breaking into your apartment when I should be fleeing the country." Zariah pulled back enough to look at his face. "You're not running?" "No." "Why not?" "Because running means leaving you behind," Taemin replied. "And I'd rather face whatever's coming than survive without you." Zariah's throat felt impossibly tight. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard." "I know," Taemin said, "but it's the truth." He kissed her then, slow and careful and achingly tender, like he was trying to memorize the taste of her before everything disappeared. And Zariah kissed him back with the desperate intensity of someone who knew this might be the last time, the last moment, the last chance to feel anything except the crushing weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. They didn't make it to the bedroom this time either. They barely made it to the floor. And afterward, lying tangled together on her living room carpet while Seoul hummed outside her windows, and federal investigators probably tracked Taemin's movements through surveillance he was too exhausted to care about, Zariah asked the question she'd been avoiding for weeks. "What happens now?" Taemin was quiet for a long time, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. "Now," he said finally, "I turn myself in." Zariah sat up so fast her head spun. "What?" "Lee has enough evidence to convict me whether I cooperate or not," Taemin replied calmly. "The raids today were comprehensive. They seized records from operations I didn't even know were still active. Fighting it just prolongs the inevitable and puts everyone in my organization at risk." "So you're just going to surrender?" "I'm going to negotiate," Taemin corrected. "Plead guilty to the charges they can prove. Provide limited cooperation about the criminal operations in exchange for reduced sentences for people in my organization who are just following orders, and accept whatever punishment the court decides I deserve." "That's insane." "That's strategic," Taemin replied. "If I fight this, Lee tears apart my entire empire looking for evidence. People get caught in the crossfire. Loyalists go to prison. The organizations that depend on my protection become vulnerable. But if I surrender now, cleanly, I can control the damage. Zariah stared at him. This man who'd built a criminal empire and was now preparing to dismantle it piece by piece to protect people who would probably forget him the moment he walked into prison. How long? She asked quietly. 15 years minimum, Taemin said. Maybe 20. Depends on how generous the prosecutor feels and whether the judge believes my cooperation is genuine. That's most of your life. I know. And you're okay with that? Taemin looked at her with absolute calm. I'm okay with you being safe. Everything else is just details. Zariah wanted to scream. Zariah. She wanted to tell him he was being stupid and self-destructive and throwing his life away for nothing. She wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him until he understood that you couldn't just sacrifice yourself and expect the people who loved you to be okay with it. Instead, she asked the question that mattered most. What about us? Taemin reached up and touched her face gently, his bandaged fingers careful against her skin. There is no us, he said quietly. Not anymore. The moment I walk into federal custody, you need to forget I exist. Don't visit. Don't write. Don't contact my lawyers or accept calls from me. Disappear completely and let everyone think we were just professional colleagues who barely knew each other. I can't do that. Yes, you can, Taemin replied, because staying connected to me means staying connected to my criminal empire. And I didn't spend 4 months trying to protect you just to watch you destroy yourself out of misplaced loyalty. It's not misplaced, Zariah whispered. I love you. I know, Taemin said softly, and that's exactly why you need to let me go, Sam. Kang Taemin turned himself in the next morning. Zariah watched the news coverage from her apartment, federal agents escorting him into the Financial Supervisory Service building in handcuffs, cameras flashing like lightning, reporters shouting questions he didn't answer. He looked calm and composed, and completely in control even as his entire empire collapsed around him. The prosecution announced charges within hours. Money laundering, criminal conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, obstruction of justice. The list was long and damning and absolutely guaranteed to put him in prison for decades. And through it all, Taemin never mentioned Zariah's name. Not once. Not in his statement to investigators. Not in his preliminary hearing. Not in the carefully worded cooperation agreement his lawyers negotiated with the prosecution. He protected her completely, even as it destroyed him. Zariah's own case moved forward separately. Obstruction charges, exactly as Lee had promised. Her lawyer negotiated a plea agreement, guilty plea in exchange for probation, community service, and a permanent mark on her record that would follow her for the rest of her life. It was the best outcome she could hope for given the circumstances, but it felt like losing anyway. Adrian called once. She didn't answer. Vanessa sent a text asking if they could talk. Zariah deleted it without reading past the first line. Her old life was gone. Her new life was built on lies and deleted evidence and choices she couldn't defend to anyone except herself. And the man she loved was sitting in a federal detention center awaiting trial, while lawyers argued about how many decades he deserved to spend in prison. She should have felt devastated. Instead, she just felt tired. 6 months later, Zariah stood in a small cafe in Itaewon, drinking coffee that tasted like burnt regret and staring at a job offer she didn't deserve. A legitimate consulting firm, completely unconnected to Taemin's empire, thoroughly vetted by her lawyer, offering a senior analyst position with clean clients and transparent operations. The kind of job she would have killed for a year ago. Now it just felt like a consolation prize. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. He wanted you to have this. Attached was a document, a property deed transferring ownership of her apartment to her name, fully paid, no mortgage, no strings attached, and a handwritten note scanned into digital format. You were never too much. You were exactly enough. Build something beautiful with the life I couldn't give you. Zariah stared at the message until her vision blurred and her hands shook, and something inside her chest finally broke open completely. He'd been planning this for months, protecting her, providing for her, making sure she survived his collapse with something solid to stand on. Even from prison, he was still trying to take care of her. She saved the document, deleted the message, and accepted the job offer. Kang Taemin was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. The trial lasted 3 months and made headlines across South Korea, exposing corruption networks, political connections, and criminal operations that had operated beneath Seoul's polished surface for decades. Testimony from former associates, evidence of money laundering spanning multiple countries, a complete dismantling of everything he'd built over 20 years. And through it all, he never once mentioned Zariah Monroe. She watched parts of the trial on news broadcasts, keeping the volume low in her new office where colleagues who didn't know her history made small talk about weather and weekend plans and all the safe topics people discussed when they were trying very hard not to acknowledge the darkness that sometimes lived inside normal-looking lives. The sentencing hearing happened on a cold March morning. Taemin stood before the judge in a prison uniform that made him look smaller somehow, his white hair cut shorter now, his expression calm and accepting as the prosecutor read a list of crimes that sounded like they belonged to someone else entirely. The judge asked if he had anything to say. Taemin spoke for less than 2 minutes. He apologized to the victims of his crimes, acknowledged the damage his organization had caused, accepted full responsibility for every choice that had led him to this courtroom. And then he said something that made Zariah's breath catch even watching through a television screen. "I spent 20 years building an empire on lies and violence and control," he said quietly. "And in the end, the only thing I built that mattered was a connection with someone who saw past all of it and chose to believe I could be better. I failed her. I failed everyone. But I won't fail the opportunity to face the consequences of those failures with honesty." The judge sentenced him immediately after. 18 years. Federal maximum security. No possibility of early release. And just like that, Kang Taemin disappeared into the prison system while Seoul moved on and forgot him like he'd never existed at all. 2 years passed. Zariah rebuilt her life slowly and carefully, one day at a time. She worked at the consulting firm and earned a reputation for ruthless competence and strategic brilliance that had nothing to do with criminal empires or deleted evidence. She bought furniture for the apartment Taemin had given her and made it feel like home instead of just a place she slept. She went to therapy and learned how to process trauma without destroying herself in the process. And she never visited him, not because she didn't want to, but because he'd asked her not to. And honoring that request felt like the only way she could prove his sacrifice hadn't been completely wasted. She thought about him constantly, though. Late at night, when Seoul glowed outside her windows and the apartment felt too quiet. During morning commutes when she passed buildings where his empire used to operate. In quiet moments when some case at work required the kind of strategic thinking he'd taught her to value in herself. He was gone, but he'd left marks on her that would never completely fade. On a warm April evening 3 years after his sentencing, Zariah received a letter. No return address. Prison postmark. Handwriting she recognized immediately. She opened it standing in her apartment while sunset painted the walls gold, and her hands shook so badly she almost tore the paper. "Zariah, I know I told you not to write. I know I asked you to forget I exist, but I'm breaking my own rule because I need you to know something. I don't regret any of it. Not meeting you. Not loving you. Not the choices that led me here. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, even if I destroyed it by being too damaged to handle something that good. I heard you're doing well, building a career, living a life that has nothing to do with me or the empire I used to control. That makes me happier than any freedom ever could. Don't write back, don't visit. Don't let me drag you back into darkness you fought so hard to escape. Just know that somewhere in a prison cell, there's a man who loves you completely and is grateful every single day that you survived him." Taemin Zariah read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in a drawer beside the apartment deed, and sat on her couch staring at nothing while tears ran down her face and Seoul hummed outside her windows. She didn't write back, but she kept the letter. 5 years after Kang Taemin's sentencing, Zariah Monroe stood in a boardroom in Gangnam presenting a strategic restructuring proposal to a room full of senior executives who looked at her with the kind of respect she'd spent her entire life earning. She was 34 years old now, senior director at one of Seoul's most respected consulting firms, recognized expert in corporate restructuring and operational efficiency. A woman who'd survived betrayal and criminal conspiracy and federal investigation and come out the other side stronger than anyone expected. The presentation went perfectly. Afterward, walking out of the building into warm summer evening air, her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "Someone left a package for you at reception." No name. Should I open it? Zariah's pulse quickened. No. I'll get it tomorrow. She couldn't explain why, but somehow she knew who it was from. The next morning, she opened the package in her office, a small box containing a plain black business card identical to the ones Taemin had given her years ago, and a handwritten note. One favor. Any request. Any time. The favor you gave me saved my life in ways you'll never know. This is me returning it. Use it wisely. A friend who still believes you were always exactly enough. Zariah stared at the card for a long time. Then she smiled, not because she planned to use it, but because after everything, after the lies and manipulation and deleted evidence and choices that destroyed lives, Kang Taemin was still trying to take care of her from inside a prison cell. She put the card in her wallet next to the first one he'd ever given her, and she went back to work building a life that belonged entirely to her. Somewhere in a federal maximum security prison 3 hours outside Seoul, Kang Taemin sat in his cell reading a magazine article about successful women in Korean business. Zariah's name was mentioned in the third paragraph. He smiled. Then he folded the magazine carefully, placed it on the small shelf beside his bunk, and lay down to sleep while fluorescent lights hummed overhead and guards walked past his cell checking locks that would keep him contained for another 13 years. He'd lost everything, his empire, his freedom, his future, but he'd saved her, and somehow that made all of it worth it. 10 years after the sentencing, on a cold November evening that felt like the world was holding its breath, Zariah Monroe received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered anyway. Miss Monroe? A woman's voice. Professional. Careful. This is Attorney Park Ji-won. I represent Kang Taemin. He's asked me to contact you regarding a personal matter. Zariah's chest tightened. Is he okay? He's fine, the attorney assured her quickly. But he wanted you to know that he's eligible for early release in 8 years due to exemplary behavior and cooperation with ongoing investigations. And when that happens, she paused. He wanted to ask if you'd consider seeing him. Just once. No obligations, no expectations. Just a conversation between two people who used to know each other. Zariah stood in her apartment staring out at Seoul's skyline while her heart hammered against her ribs, and a decade of carefully constructed distance threatened to collapse completely. Tell him yes, she said quietly. Are you sure? Yes, Zariah repeated. Tell him I'll be there. 8 years suddenly felt like both an eternity and no time at all. But Zariah Monroe had survived worse things than waiting. She'd survived betrayal and manipulation and loving someone dangerous enough to destroy her. She'd survived federal investigation and criminal charges and rebuilding her life from nothing. She'd survived being called too much by people too weak to handle her strength. And she would survive 8 more years of waiting for a man who'd sacrificed everything to make sure she could stand exactly where she was standing now. Powerful, respected, and finally, completely herself. The woman who was never too much. Just exactly enough.